Hello and welcome to the first podcast of the year 2024 from the Belt and Road Institute in Sweden. My name is Hussein Askary. Today is January the 8th. As we usually do the beginning of the year, we discuss Chinese foreign policy, but also development around the Belt and Road Initiative. But first of all, the last year witnessed some of very, very dramatic and terrible developments, but also some very good ones. Starting with the bad ones is that the war in Ukraine, which is in our neighborhood here in Europe, has continued and even got bloodier with the so-called counter-offensive, Ukrainian counter-offensive, and everything is at a standstill. They don't look very good. But also the last year, towards the end of the last year, we witnessed the horrible war of Gaza by Israel following the Hamas attacks on Israelis. The targets on October 7th, and the horrible war. I mean, many nations like South Africa are calling the shots on Israel, saying that this is genocide. It should be brought up to the International Court of Justice. And the enormous suffering of the Palestinian people, while the world is unable to do much except in pushing for a solution, a peaceful solution, a ceasefire, and humanitarian aid. At the same time, we had as one of the consequences of this that the Ansarullah in Yemen, the Houthis, they decided to block and actually seize some Israeli ships and Israel-bound ships because they want to contribute to, they say, lifting the suffering of the Palestinian people. But as a consequence of that, many shipping companies have decided to divert their routes from the Red Sea to around Africa, the Cape of Good Hope. And there is a fear of this disruption of supply chains on a global scale because of that. But at the same time, the last year witnessed, for example, we had the Third Belt and Road Initiative, which was a great success. Myself and my colleague, Stephen Brower, the chairman of the Belt and Road Institute, we had the great honor of attending that forum in Beijing in person. It was a great success. Of course, at the year 2023, Italy, one of the G7 countries, opted out of the Belt and Road Initiative. But remember, at the same time, we had 20 nations joining the Belt and Road the same year, making the number 152 nations. So those who are outside the Belt and Road Initiative are right now a minority. We also had a major breakthrough in diplomacy for China with the Iran-Saudi Arabia normalization of relations, which is very, very important for the stabilization of the situation in West Asia and the so-called Middle East. So anyway, today we have, as we did last year, we want to focus, first of all, by inviting a special guest from Washington on US-Chinese relations, because these are definitely, even according to the Chinese leadership, the most important relationship between nations, and also the implications of the China-US relations on the world. So I would like to welcome Mr. William Jones from Washington. Thank you for taking the time for being with us.
Thanks for having me here, Hussein.
Thank you. You may present yourself to the audience.
Well, I was the White House correspondent for Executive Intelligence Review for about 20 years, during beginning the 1990s and on through the middle of the early 2000s. Covered foreign policy in many different areas which the U.S. was involved in, but most specifically, since the meeting of President Clinton with President Jiang Zemin in Seattle, it became clear to me there that this was going to become the most important relationship the United States had, and therefore I concentrated on beginning to study more seriously China, learning Chinese, and traveling there to get a picture of what the possibilities were on U.S.-China relationships. And I have, spoken on this and written on this extensively, over the last 20, 30 years. And I'm following also very closely in this very difficult time the developments on the U.S.-China relationship side.
Okay. Recently, like at the end of the year, President Xi Jinping held a major meeting. It's called a Working Group on Foreign Policy, something like this, where all China's ambassadors abroad were back at home in Beijing and to discuss China's foreign policy in this year and the coming years. And of course, President Xi, he made some very transparent points about China's position in the world and the role of diplomats and diplomacy. There's something which I would like you also to explain for people. What is he calls major power diplomacy with Chinese characteristics. This has been the headlines a lot. But also he made a number of very important points to the ambassadors. There's like, on the one hand, China will continue its policy to build a community for a shared future for mankind, keep working on the Belt and Road Initiative, making friends, that this is the priority of the diplomats and Chinese foreign policy, but at the same time, not being naive and realizing that the world has changed and challenges from outside China, especially in its relationship with the US and other countries like the EU, are a big problem, which has to be faced head on, as he says. But first of all, of course, we had this last year, we can come back to it, the meeting between President Biden and President Xi Jinping in San Francisco. But first of all, I want you to explain for our audience what is meant by major power diplomacy with Chinese characteristics. What does that mean?
Well, this only became an issue at the point that China on the global scene became a major power. Now, China has really always been something of a major power. Look, it's been the most populous, has long been the most populous nation in the world, and even when they were very poor, they were a force to be reckoned with. But the rapid economic growth of China, starting from the late 1990s, the 2000, to the present moment, has really propelled them into the driver's seat economically. It's been the major economic driver in the world, but also has brought with it more demands on their policy making, which now has more of an influence on world politics probably than ever before. And in order to do that, a new method or methodology of operating had to be brought to bear to the foreign policy of China, in order that people who are responsible for implementing it understand what they must do, A, in asserting China's own interests, B, in making China a positive contribution to the world, and also C, in order to fend off any illegitimate attacks against China coming from other countries. And the pinnacle of this was with the problem with the major powers. That is, not China's relationship with the countries of Southeast Asia or of Central Asia, but more importantly, China's relationship, first of all, with the United States, but also China's relationship with Russia. And these were more significant because the amount of problems that could be caused by tensions in these relationships were something that really would upset the balance in the world, whereas problems with smaller countries could be, I think, resolved much more easily. So major power diplomacy was important because now China was a major power itself. It had its own interest. It had its own interests in how the world economic and financial system would have to operate, so that it was beneficial to all parties, including to China, but also to other parties, and that they also had a major role to play now as an important economic and political power in trying to resolve crises that arise, which were not necessarily crises in which China itself had been involved. And this was something different than had been the case previously. There was always this idea historically in China to try and separate them from the other powers of the world and to exist in harmony within the Asia Pacific region. But at the present point of world politics, these problems that occur in far off places, like in the Middle East, have an effect on China's future, and therefore China has an importance in asserting that. So major power diplomacy was an attempt to create relations between the larger nations to prevent conflict, first of all, but also possibly to create a sense of harmony between these big powers in order to avoid a major conflict. It was similar to China's overall diplomacy, which is kind of a good neighbor policy. China, with its economic potential, being able to help other countries, but it was different because the problems that could arise, especially if these other major powers viewed China as a rival, this could lead to conflict, and therefore it had a different role to play than its general diplomacy with other countries.
Yeah, that's important. Recently, I was in a conference in Beijing, and the same panel, we had some people from the military, and I mentioned the question of the breakthrough with the Saudi-Iranian relations. And one of the gentlemen there, he's still, I think it's in the military, he said, look, people think there was some secret negotiations and stuff going on. He said, don't look for the secret negotiations. There, you will not find them. He said everything was based on the goodwill of China towards both nations, that China was a trustworthy. And he referenced the fact that what he called the 30 golden years of peace in Southeast Asia, that this is one of the important certificates of performance for China, that over 30 years you had no wars in that part of the world. And that's thanks a lot, mainly to China's role in that region. But also the question that China is now playing a role which is, commensurate to its enormous economic power, but without replacing we will come back to this question of the new world order or not new world order. This week, there was a conference in Beijing also, where Wang Yi, the foreign minister, it was a celebration of the 45th anniversary of the establishment of relations between the United States and China. And the Wang Yi, one of the important things he said there is that we are not seeing the United States as a rival. We're not competing with China. We don't with the U.S. We don't want to replace the United States as the biggest power in the world. We want, and he actually he said, the bottom line of the relation is not to make major achievements, but the fact that the United States and China are not in a conflict is a great blessing for the world. So the expectations are not to become like be in love with each other, but the expectation is not, at least not to get into conflict with each other. And I think this, but the problem is that the last year was a really roller coaster for the U.S.-Chinese relations. How can Chinese or anybody else trust the United States to make deals, make agreements when things can change quickly? This year we have now also the question of we will have American elections. There are many people in the United States who are looking forward to have a conflict with China. We will have also the Taiwan elections, which would be an important thing. But how do you assess what was achieved in the San Francisco summit, what it's important, and how can this play into this coming year and next years?
Well, San Francisco was, I wouldn't go so far as to call it a game changer, but it was, it resolved the relationship from going south. It stopped the downward motion of U.S.-China relations because there were agreements made between the two heads of state, which created, I think, kind of a floor beyond which the U.S.-China relations could not descend. President Xi, from all reports, was more specific at this San Francisco meeting with regard to what China's motivations and intentions were, but also with regard to what they considered the red lines. And he spoke in detail on this. A lot of this was made public. I mean, it was very interesting to watch this. and that President Biden, in his turn, asserted a commitment to maintaining the U.S. policy of not allowing that floor to be dropped, especially with regard to the commitments to the one China policy, no Taiwan independence. The U.S. does not want to undermine China economically, and all of these things were actually came out of the agreement that the two presidents had. Now, what obviously, as the time went on, we saw, more sanctions, more restrictions on the export of semiconductors. A lot of the things that had been churning within the departments were still being affected. But nevertheless, what the San Francisco meeting did was establish kind of a floor on the agreement between the two sides. But it also created the relationship, more importantly, I think, the relationships between the two governments at all stages of development. That is, prior to that, there were meetings of the Commerce Department. All of these things had been shut down because of this balloon affair, this alleged spy balloon that had, the hoax that had been totally exposed now, even in the U.S. press. There was no spy balloon. It was all a hoax. But that led to a freezing, effectively a freezing in the U.S.-China relationship. San Francisco was the thaw that broke that up, but it didn't change U.S. policy in many respects, but it created the relationship between these countries at every level, so that when problems did arise, there was the ability for the two sides to talk, be it in terms even on the military side of things. Now, which was also a something that was lost in the after the balloon affair, that the two militaries were not talking to each other, and there were a lot of confrontations in the South China Sea and elsewhere that would have required some kind of solution through negotiation. They did not occur. They're back in place, so that structure has been set up as a means of, I think, damage control or crisis management is probably what you would call it, that didn't exist prior to that. What Wang Yi did in his speech was really reiterate the demands that China had said, that reiterate what had been promised to President Xi at the presidential level, to remind the United States that China does not simply want this to be said, but they wants action, implementation, which is congruent with what had been decided by the two presidents. So on the one hand, it was, he underlined in his speech the importance of the U.S.-China relationship and some of the progress that had been made. But there was also a certain, I would call it a warning, that this is what we expect coming out of the meeting going forward. And so it was a kind of a wake-up call. Remember what was said at the San Francisco meeting and try and operate on that.
Yeah, this is interesting because of the distrust which is building up. I mean, I felt this myself in discussions with many Chinese experts and scholars, and some people, and I'm going to interview one of them. He says, China's policy should be to go south. Doesn't mean that going down, but going to the global south and establishing and building new relations and using the Belt and Road as a means to accomplish that, because the United States and the EU seem to be a bit hopeless because they say something and they do something different. And now there's a big discussion in China whether this relationship with the United States and the EU, especially on the economic side, with all the sanctions, the semiconductor wars, is sustainable or not, but that there should be a move more to new partnerships, not to be too dependent on trade and economic relations with the United States and China. Now, in this concern of one of the big news of the last year was the expansion of the BRICS group. That's the Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa into the 10 countries now, with the inclusion of Iran, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Ethiopia. Of course, Argentina was included, but the new president opted out of that. But this is creating totally new dynamic in the world economy with the inclusion of these other nations. And of course, China and India are great, heavyweight in the world. But the question is, I mean, China doesn't say they don't want to replace the United States. They don't want to replace the so-called current world order, but it seems that the so-called rules-based order, which is that the United States and its allies do what they please to do and call it rules, or that should be a new type of order. Now, some people say it will be a new Cold War. They talk about multipolarism, that there will be many different poles in the world, like Cold War situation. But the Chinese talk about multilateralism. So what is the difference between multilateralism and on the one hand and multipolarity on the other hand, but also we have the rules-based order?
Well, China doesn't want to divide up the world into, rival parts. In the U.S. side, I mean, they've been insistent on the fact that they do not see the United States as a rival, whereas the United States, this is really predominant in most of the statements that they make. And China says that we have to come away from that the United States has got to come away from that and is working in order to try and accomplish that. Now, at the top, the highest levels, I think at the levels of institutions, at the levels of the political elites, that is not a prevalent viewpoint, and they realize that. So they have to work with that and kind of do enough crisis management to prevent the fact that the U.S. is viewing them as a rival, that will not lead to conflict. But at the same time, I think they feel that this can also be subject to change. And the other aspect of the San Francisco meeting was that Xi not only met with President Biden, but he met with all kinds of delegations from the U.S., both the economic delegation, the remaining flying tiger came with the delegation, everything that had a positive influence, a positive relationship to China. He tried to use that as a means of the people, using the people-to-people relationship to try and change the atmosphere within the United States, including his invitation to, what was it, 500,000 American students from coming to China to study, setting up again the rail links or the air links between the U.S. and China, so that more and more travel could happen. China, I think, views in the long term that this relationship with the United States can become more of a partnership than a rivalry, as viewed from the U.S., but it's going to take a while. And at the present moment, and as was indicated also at this meeting with the diplomats at the end of last year, the U.S.-China relationship was important, but it wasn't at center stage. What was at center stage was Chinese diplomacy more generally, in terms of being able to utilize the support that President Xi's proposals on the Global Development Initiative, the Global Security Initiative, which have also been accepted, I mean, as proposed by the United Nations, that this becomes the basis, the support for China, not in changing the world order, but in bringing order back into the world, which has been disorderly because of the attempt by the United States and its so-called allies to become the rules maker for the world. The rules have been set up in terms of the post-war situation with the creation of the United Nations and the establishment of what was a world order, which has been undermined through the Cold War and through the post-Cold War era, with the emergence of the United States for a while as the sole superpower, as viewing itself as the ones who had to make the rules. That this has disturbed the world order, which China is trying to bring back into place. The second thing is that, of course, that China now is a major player, is a major power, and that therefore should also have an influence. Its proposals and its suggestions and its orientation for a more harmonious world should become matters of consideration by other countries. And you still have a situation in the United States where they're not quite willing to accept that. And that is creating a problem. But the fact that China has support from these other countries, the global South in particular, the BRICS, the SCO, important organizations, but there's also changes that they feel are going to occur in terms of the so-called allies of the United States within Western Europe in particular, which is at the moment in a crisis, but it's a crisis in which China really offers a way out in many respects.
Yeah.
And so I think they're optimistic, but again, all their cards are not going to be placed on the U.S.-China relationship at this point.
No, that's important. I mean, we saw this at the Belt and Road Forum, the third Belt and Road Forum in Beijing, where China presented a long-term plan for cooperation with other nations over the next 10 years and even beyond that. But also saw the reaction from the other nations who welcomed the Belt and Road as a vehicle for establishing a new, system of governance among nations based on economic development. I think the Chinese are very, very keen on that the Belt and Road Initiative, the Global Development Initiative, the Global Security Initiative, and the Global Civilization Initiative. There's a symbiosis between security, peace, and economic development. So they never separate the question of economic development, economic cooperation from establishing security and peace. I think this is one of the success factor behind the Iran-Saudi normalization, because China built a massive trust with economic development plans with Saudi Arabia through the comprehensive strategic agreements with Saudi Arabia last year and Iran earlier this year for a 25-year long-term economic cooperation, transfer of technology in every aspect, in telecom, IT, space technology, nuclear power development. All these aspects, China has opened its enormous economic prowess to other nations, and that's the basis for successful diplomacy in the view of the Chinese. And I think here in the EU and in the United States, we are missing the train, so to speak, because we are not utilizing the economic aspects, but merely the coercion, security, and military solutions for the problems around the world. So I think this is a very interesting, that the symbiosis between economic development and security and peace becoming a bigger and bigger part of China's foreign policy. How does the picture look from the United States of this?
Well, here also there could be a benefit if they would work together with China on the Belt and Road Initiative. We see the situation in the U.S. economy is extremely dire with regard to infrastructure in particular, with regard to people's standard of living, the rate of inflation. We've seen that gone up exponentially over the last few years, and there seems to be no hope in terms of continuing the policies that now exist at this point. And of course, China is willing to work, but the United States won't accept that because they reject anything that's made in China, and therefore they're kind of shooting themselves in the foot. But they view simply China's rise as a threat to their ability to determine policy on the global scale, and therefore they're doing everything within terms that possibly don't lead to conflict to undermine China's economic development. The sanctions against the semiconductors. Now, there was actually some breakthrough that I haven't looked at very closely, but in terms of a U.S.-China cooperative scientific agreement, which has developed new forms of graphene in semiconductors, which apparently is going to have a revolutionary effect. This was a result of a China-U.S. collaborative effort, right?
Yeah, exactly. I saw that this was not very big news, but I saw also that was reported somewhere that this scientific cooperation between Chinese and American experts created this major breakthrough. It's fascinating.
it's still going on in spite of all these restrictions. And you know, that's kind of the countervailing force to what is the dominant, you know, anti-China attitude here in the United States, which is the only thing that's really going to provide a way out. The United States financially is not in a position to do a major development program, in spite of what President Biden is saying. The amount of money that's going to military spending at this point makes it almost impossible for the United States to return to becoming a major industrial power. They can continue with military production, but the roads and the highways and the standard of living of the population is going to deteriorate continually unless that situation is changed. And nobody's really willing to take on, you know, the need of an overhaul of the U.S. that really the international financial system, which would allow the ability for the United States to develop. So much of what's being talked about in terms of the so-called infrastructure program here in the United States is really a dead letter until the political situation, until the political attitude is changed with regard to China, with regard to the rest of the world.
Yeah, I think we have a similar situation here in Europe, where we have a increasing militarization of the economy, nations preparing themselves for war, and the military-industrial production capacity is being the biggest investments here instead of infrastructure, education, and healthcare, where we have major problems with. But also, I mean, these ideas floated by the United States and the EU as to replace the Belt and Road Initiative with this so-called global infrastructure partnership, or the global gateway, the EU's plan. These are, of course, I mean, we can't build infrastructure here in Europe. I mean, how can we build abroad? And therefore, I mean, to break away from China in terms of both scientific research, but also industrial infrastructure development, you know, it's a big loser for us here. As China will continue to develop, even with the question of the semiconductor. Of course, China still needs the United States and Europe in that sense, but if you pressure China too much on that level, as we saw with Huawei, they will go find their own means to develop their own technology and become independent of the rest of us. And that's a major problem. I mean, ending on a positive note, and somehow relatively positive. I mean, your late wife, Marcia Freeman, was a great researcher. I had the honor of working sometimes with her on space technology. Recently, we, of course, the U.S. ambassador to China, he's more of a troublemaker rather than a diplomat. He actually said something about NASA's cooperation, or space cooperation with China, is that it's China's fault that there is no big cooperation between China and the United States. And I think, as Marcia, your wife, the late wife, was indicating a lot of the times, that the space frontier, this is the future of humankind, and the cooperation among nations will not only establish peace among nations, but also break a lot of the chains of so-called limited resources and limited technology and lack of knowledge here on Earth. And I wonder if will be a time when China and the United States and other nations, of course, will work together in space.
Well, look, this has been the commitment of the space community, as it was Marcia Freeman's, my wife's commitment.
I can see you have some of the work on the behind you.
Yeah, this is her first book, How We Got to the Moon, the story of the German space pioneers, the beginnings of the space program in the 1920s at a department store in Berlin, where they were conducting some of these experiments and stuff. That was really her bailiwick, and she was committed to that. The statements by Ambassador Burns have created something of an outcry on the Chinese side, because what he said, he came here to the U.S. And was speaking at Brookings about U.S.-China relations. The gist of his comments were generally the importance of the alliances in the Asia-Pacific, not about China. But he was asked a question that comes up all the time here, even within the space community. Why isn't the U.S. cooperating with China in space? And he said, my view is I haven't seen any indication that China wants to cooperate with the U.S. in space, which was a really just totally a bald-faced lie, because he knows, as everybody knows, that in the beginning, China was more interested in cooperating with the United States than any other country in space. The first Chinese astronaut came to the U.S., I think it was I can't remember the year of it, maybe 10 years ago, Yang Li Wei, and he went up to Capitol Hill and he was greeted by Bill Nelson, who is now the NASA administrator, who showed him around to his office. And then Yang Li Wei went to Cape Kennedy to look at the facilities down there. They were very interested in cooperating. The reason it didn't occur is that there is in the U.S. Congress a legislation by Senator Wolf, unfortunately used to be my congressman here, saying that the U.S. cannot, for security reasons, cannot cooperate with China in the manned space program. So that put a limit on what the U.S. could do, in spite of the fact that most of the people in NASA would like to cooperate with China, because they're very impressed by how quickly China has developed, and they're very admiring about it. And so that was a big issue at the time. I remember that Marcia, she's known every NASA administrator, as far as I know. I mean, even Jim Webb, who was before her time in space, she had met him when he was aging, and he, like Marcia, had Parkinson's, and they talked about the space program. But also every administrator since then, I know she had talked to. And one of those was Mike Griffin, who was appointed the administrator under Trump, and he was asked if he would go to China to look at the Chinese space program, and he was very skeptical, right? And Marcia talked to him. He says, "Look, if you go to China, I mean, you're an engineer, right? You're somebody who knows the nitty gritty of these things. If you go to China, you'll find engineers like yourself who you'll be able to talk to, and you will be excited by what you see there." And he did go there. And when he came back, he had a totally different attitude to what the Chinese were accomplishing, and he was very impressed. But because of this legislation, this has not been possible for. There's cooperation there. The United States now asked China for some of the moon rock that they got from the far side of the moon, and they're going to give it to them, and they will cooperate on this. Mm. But still, China made it clear that you really got to do something about this Wolf Amendment in order to do that. So, what Marcia did in her books was primarily to maintain the notion of this international cooperation. The fact that the U.S., which put the man on the moon, was dependent on these German engineers, who were brought up, were sucked into a scientific program instead of going to the Eastern Front, during World War II, came to the United States and accomplished what the United States probably would have accomplished on its own, but it would have taken much longer. She also wrote a book on the U.S.-Soviet cooperation in the Mir shuttle program, which had been, given a bad reputation because there was an accident there, and there were books coming out saying, "Oh, cooperating with the Soviets, you never get anywhere." So she wrote a book about the science, the biological sciences that were developed on the Mir program, which provided the basis for the International Space Station. I mean, the lessons learned on the Mir, with U.S. astronauts cooperating on the Mir, laid the basis for the International Space Station, the ISS. And that has, within the space community, that is still accepted as the norm, this international cooperation. Nobody's been able to, counter that. And I think that that's a positive sign, similar to what we see with, in the general population with regard to this anti-China stuff. Nobody really buys into it. Mm-hmm. Nobody really accepts this. There is not, again, on the people-to-people relationship, there is not a contradiction or a rivalry between these two people, and nobody sees that. And I think the Chinese position in trying to use this people-to-people relationship, the exchanges, which will kind of churn a new atmosphere within the United States, can also lead to the type of political changes that that we would like to have.
Yeah. No, it's wonderful. I mean, I had the great honor of that she contributed, Marsha contributed a chapter on Africa's space future in the space in the book which I co-authored, the Extending the New Silk Road to West Asia and Africa. And she was gracious enough to contribute a whole chapter on development of the space programs of Africa, which is fascinating. And that's her passion. I think it's a wonderful way to look at the world, as astronauts do when they are in the International Space Station. You know, here you have astronauts representing different nations, but they look at on Earth from above and they say, wow, this is our home. Every one of us, this is where this is what unites us all. And they don't see borders among nations, and they work together for the better of the humankind. And I think this is a great point to conclude our interesting discussion. The world is fraught with dangers and conflict, but I think there is still hope for things. If you have any final word, please go ahead.
Well, I think the situation is such that for your viewers, of course, that China is now a major player in the world. It does not have the view of becoming a hegemon. In fact, it is the idea of a hegemony is alien to China, but they do want these good relations with all the countries in the world. And I think it's very important to look closely at what China's doing and not look at the narrative that you get mainly in the Western media because of the antagonism that they want to create to try and undermine China's ability to grow. And on the major power relationship, China has always said that the Russia-China relationship is kind of a paradigm for what they feel the major power relationship should be. These countries are not in an alliance. They're not in a military alliance. They have differences of opinion on many questions. But nevertheless, as neighbors, they have learned to cooperate and to work on a win-win basis. This is what China would like to do with the United States. And it's my conviction that over time, when we have gotten through this the mole, the haze that exists within the United States right now with regard to the real intentions and motivations and actions of China, I think we will come out of this in a situation in which they also have something of a major power relationship, which is harmonious rather than based on the notion of rivalry. But I think going forward, there's a lot we have to do with the dangerous situations that exist within the Ukraine war to close the Ukraine war and to stop the genocide in Gaza. I just mentioned that you talked about Africa, the role that South Africa is playing in exposing the insanity and the cruelty that is being exuded by the present Israeli government in Gaza by bringing it to the International Court of Justice is extremely important. Marsha and I were in South Africa at the first International Astronautical Congress that had ever been held on the African continent some 6-7 years ago. And there, South Africa represented all of Africa, and other African nations were there because they see that not only in space, but in scientific and technological development, that is the key to the future. And they're moving forward now together with China and also together with Russia. And I think that is the direction in which the world is going to go. And the rest of the world has got to begin to understand that they have got to be a part of it as well, Europeans and the United States.
Wonderful. William Jones from Washington, D.C., thank you very much for your great contribution to our podcast. Thank you for spending the time with us.
You're most welcome. Thank you for having me.